Okay, now the medium-term budget policy statement will be presented to Parliament tomorrow afternoon by the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. The mini-budget gives Parliament and the nation at large an update on the Treasury's assessment of the current state of the economy. Well, to unpack this further as we set the scene 24 hours before, I'm joined in studio by the CEO of Inkunzi Wealth Group, Owen Nkomo, and then on the line via Zoom is Investec's chief economist, Annabel Bishop, and we're also joined by market analyst Zwelakhe Mnguni from Benguela Global Fund Management. So, Annabel, welcome, and Zwelakhe, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Owen is with me in studio. Just an overriding question first to each of you, if you may answer it as briefly as you can. What are your expectations, just overall, overriding, before we get into the nitty-gritties of what we can expect? Annabel, you first.
Okay, thank you. Hello. I think that we're probably going to see revenue undershoot by 50 billion rand. So what that really means is that government does a budget estimate at the start of the year in February, and they say that they expect to collect so much revenue for the fiscal year, which runs from April to March next year, and we think they're going to collect 50 billion less than they expected. So what this really means is they're probably going to have to borrow some more money. Okay. Because of the fact that they are overspending. And by overspending, we just mean that they are likely to spend more than they projected at that February time.
Zwelakhe, what do you expect?
Look, I'm in line with Annabel, but I think the one thing is I do think that there has been a bit of a slowdown in terms of the spending by the departments. I mean, the money has been allocated, but I don't think a lot of it has reached the ground. So we might see that we might end up in balance. That's my view. I think the need for borrowing remains, and it's likely to remain for quite some time.
Okay. Owen?
Yeah, I expect almost the same as last year in terms of the tonality of the speech. And obviously, we are expecting the budget to have undershoot, definitely. And I think what's important is most probably we're going to see a reallocation of budgets from other ministries to the priority ministries. And I think the president's speech yesterday was a strategic speech, probably leading into the budget. He had some conversations with Mr. Godongwana. I think they're setting up a base to make sure that those ministries that are particularly in infrastructure, for example, do get more allocations. And we looking to see what's going to happen with the public enterprises budget allocations as well. Okay,
Annabel, by how much more can we borrow?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? If you borrow too much, you get credit rating downgrades. And that's really, I think, the risk here. You know, I was actually having a look at what Moody's said after our budget in February, because, of course, now we're just having the mini budget, the MTBPS, the half-year update. And Moody's said we do not expect a major widening in the fiscal deficits since government is likely to reduce its spending commensurately. Now, of course, this is obviously the risk for South Africa. But the one point I did want to make is that we're currently at 51% of our projected expenditure, and we are halfway through the fiscal year. So you would think that seems all right then. But of course, if we have a look at where we were last year at this time, also by the end of September data, we were at the figure of 47%. So you can see why markets are worried. Why they're worried is because if we borrow a lot more, of course, that increases the supply of debt. That then obviously would likely push down the cost of debt, or sorry, the actual value of the debt itself, and of course, increase bond yields, increase long-term borrowings. And as we all know, if you increase the rate at which you borrow, then of course your debt burden becomes obviously bigger to service, and of course that's what financial markets are worried about. But of course we have seen the rand pull back a little bit today ahead of the budget, and I think it's because these figures haven't been so bad. That came in very recently, the very latest government finance figures. Also, of course, as well, revenue is important. Last year at this time we were at 46% of what we were supposed to collect for the total year, so 46%, and obviously again, you know, that was half year, and now we're at 45. So I think budget figures have improved a little bit from where they were earlier in the year. So markets might be a little bit less worried. worried. But your big question, how much more can we borrow? I mean, that really is the kicker. The credit rating agencies could well put us on negative outlooks after this budget if we do see a big increase in planned borrowings, and of course that's the risk of a downgrade. We don't think so. We've actually just got our debt estimate at 72.8% for this fiscal year 23-24, and that government previously had it at 72.2. So you can see there's a very slight increase.
Yeah. Other places, Zwelakhe, you think where there could be spending cuts? I mean, Godongwana indicating a few days ago that besides the borrowing, we should expect some spending cuts.
First of all, I think it's going to be difficult for them to cut in some areas, in the sense of, as we saw the settlement on the wage bill. I mean, that is running slightly ahead of inflation. I think in reality, I mean, there are three major costs on our budgets that are ahead of all the costs. So it's the debt service cost, it's the social grants, and it's a wage bill. And I cannot see any of those things being cut anytime soon, especially in the run-up to an election next year. So I think the best bet is to probably hope for a better discipline within the department. So the department getting a bigger or better bang for the buck. Secondly, the SOEs showing some improvements, and I think both those things are quite a long stretch at the current state of our country.
Yeah, I was just thinking now, Owen. The borrowings are not that bad, that high. I mean, budget-wise, Annabel says we're okay, but we're not growing. The economy is not growing. We're growing at about 0.3% to 0.5%, and that is a challenge. I mean, you've got the US, you've got the UK, for example, they have huge debts and stuff like that.
To GDP, yes.
Yeah, to GDP, but they are growing. The economies are growing. We are not really 0 point something. You could be standing still.
Yeah, definitely. There's still room to increase the amount of borrowing, but my biggest problem is that outside of government salaries or the so-called government wage bill, the social grants, the next big challenge that we have in the country is the cost of the borrowing. It's very punitive, and that is money that could be used to drive the economy to grow. And I think the government is in a very big trap that they've created over the past bunch of decades, because they have created an economy that has made most South Africans dependent on the government, through social grants, like Zwelakhe was saying.
And you cannot cut
you cannot cut there. And this 350 that we thought was going to be just for the period of the duration of COVID, you cannot touch that because you've got an election year next year. And all of these social grants, I really think we need to think about them differently, because they are a very big bane to the economy and to our budgets.
Yeah. Because in balancing the act, in balancing the books, Annabel, I mean, Minister Godongwana has to be mindful of, the economic growth or lack of it, or the pace at which it is growing. In your view, what is hampering our growth?
Yes, hi. So I think that's that's really a vital point, and of course we know that it's Eskom and Transnet from a production perspective, and of course we know that government's unlikely to increase VAT in a pre-election period, and of course as well consumers really suffering in South Africa. We've had a couple of years of higher interest rates. So that's also contributed to weaker economic growth. It's a difficult time. We have monetary tightening and, of course, the risk of fiscal tightening as well. So that together, obviously, in itself puts the brakes on the economy. The good news is that inflation has come down quite substantially. While we have had a little uptick recently because of higher fuel prices, we're now going into a low fuel price period. And, of course, we expect to see inflation come down next year. In fact, we expect to see interest rate cuts next year. We don't think they're going to raise VAT, and we think possibly they might look at increasing capital gains tax. But we need to bear in mind that now is not the time when they actually tend to change taxes. That's rather in the big budget, the February budget. We're now in the mini budget, the medium-term budget
but
policy statement.
Could we see an indication of which taxes they could tinker with come February in this midterm budget? Could there be some bad news?
Yes, I think you're right. I think that's exactly it. They could give some indications. Now, what we think will happen is that they probably will not adjust for bracket creep, which already might give them 20 to 25 billion. Of course, we're saying they'd be 50 billion short. And what that really means is you don't change the brackets because inflation has obviously been higher. So someone might just be earning a bit more because they've had a salary increase that's in line with inflation. But in real terms, they're not really earning more. So, of course, that's the bracket creep issue. As you said as well, a possibility on capital gains tax. I agree with our previous panelists' comment that they probably are going to trim expenditure in some areas where there's underperformance. It's probably not going to yield much, but they probably will look to also as well continue to try and reduce wastage, inefficiency, and of course corruption. But let's not forget, SARS has done well in terms of increasing the tax take, and that's likely to be a positive announcement as well. You know, their progress there.
But I mean, last year they benefited, our tax revenue benefited from that commodity price upcycle that we saw, which has turned as well. Like, I don't know where else, besides maybe that capital gains tax, where else we could see some benefit for the fiscus.
Look, I think we've seen a few cases where the SARS has won against the large corporates. I think we've also seen more recently the transition of Anglo Gold out of South Africa, and it looks like they'll score another 4.5 billion there. So there may be little windfalls that in aggregate do alleviate a bit of pain, but I do think that Annabel is right in that you could be just getting a benefit from a tax bracket creep more than anything else, and then try and delay the increases to once things have settled down. And I'm particularly conscious about the election year, and I think they're going to try and do a lot to try and avoid upsetting the voters.
So we shouldn't expect too much austerity, Owen?
No, I don't believe they'll go that route, particularly because you know, if you introduce a lot of austerity, you're stifling the growth of the economy, which already doesn't exist. You're taking money out of the economy, which actually needs to be spent in the economy. But my biggest worry is that with every budget that we've seen, if you have a look at all the articles that get written post that budget, it's always a tough balancing act. The minister had very limited options, and you know, the tonality is always the same. But what I worry about is the fact that we're just kicking the can down, you know, which is a big concern for future generations. If we don't deal aggressively with some of these unnecessary expenditures, if we're not sending people to jail who have brought money back to the fiscus when people do not have facilities, or people that have abused government funding, I think we're not going to have any change coming through anytime soon, which is actually unfortunate because we're not producing enough taxpayers on an annual basis.
Yeah, if there could be some bad news in this budget, medium-term budget, where could you come from? What do you think? Where could it come from?
Look, I think obviously the limited, you know, revenue collection relative to the expenditures of the government, to put it very simply. There is some liabilities that we have accepted as the government that we will not be able to move up to get ourselves away from. And I think that that's where I see a big problem.
Yeah. How big bailouts could we see, Annabel? You mentioned Eskom and Transnet earlier in answering one of the questions. Is there a large chance that we could see government needing to give bailouts to both Eskom and Transnet?
Yes, I think that's a key point. You know, Eskom is under this debt relief program, which really means that it has to meet a certain criteria in order to allow its debt to be paid off by government. And that's because most of Eskom's debt is actually under guarantee by government. Not the case with Transnet. Transnet is very little of its debt guaranteed by government. And in fact, they've signaled a 100 billion rand bailout requirement. Now, of course, that just damages the budget so substantially. And of course, you know, that's a big risk that we see. So we think that there might be conditions that are imposed on Transnet, like they were imposed on Eskom for its debt relief, but of course now instead for the bailout. The problem we have is that these utilities, and we're talking about Eskom now, when they did get bailouts, actually just put that through as income. You know, they didn't put it through as a bailout, and of course that's not right. It's not income. So there are huge problems, as we all know, at Transnet, which is a key reason why our exports also have been so weak, as well as a dip in commodity prices, and that of course has negatively impacted government finances very badly. We have seen some positivity on the Eskom front with the electricity capacity availability factor rising to 60% and likely above, as some of the units come back online in different power generation plants, and the utility becomes improved in terms of its generation. And of course, that is positive for the economy. It doesn't help though if we produce the goods, we can't export them because of the problems at at Transnet. So we think that that is going to be the big problem, which the credit rating agencies really worry about as well. I don't know if Transnet will get its 100 billion in one lump sum. It might have to wait a few years. It might be spaced out. And I really think government's going to become a lot tougher, and they're going to actually raise the criteria to access these bailouts and, of course, these debt guarantees. In fact, government actually wants to wind down all debt guarantees on SOEs.
Now, another matter I just want us to discuss is the question of, Owen mentioned it a little bit earlier, around the need for change, structural reforms. Could this medium-term budget, or should we look at it to expect Minister Godongwana to indicate whether or not government has the appetite to implement the urgently needed structural reforms? Zwelakhe, what do you think?
Sure. I think it's a very tough question. I mean, have they got the ability to implement any structural reforms? I mean, I think it's firstly about willpower, and I don't get a sense that there is a very strong willpower in this government to basically implement reforms. I mean, the ESCOM separation of distribution and generation might be one example that we cited, but I don't know how far, what else could be reformed. I mean, Annabel highlights an example where they could give terms to Transnet as conditions for bailout. But again, the big challenge is that many of these state-owned enterprises are actually not well run, and not all of them, but there are a majority that are not well run, and we keep plowing money into these things because there isn't the capability to basically improve the operations and the efficiency of those businesses. So I think what would be a fantastic reform would be to look at how they can improve the operations and the professionalize the management of these businesses, and instead of parachuting people from I don't know where. But I think that could be one major thing that could improve the performance, and look at private partnerships in the infrastructure space, both from a funding point of view, but also from an operational point of view. So if you have a Transnet, could a private sector element be a contractor that runs that business without losing ownership of the infrastructure that belongs to the public?
Yeah. Owen, what's your view? Have you picked up, government has got the appetite to, I mean, everybody talks about the need for structural reforms, and that is becoming more and more urgent. You said you are worried about that kicking down the can, down the line. I mean, have you picked up anything that could indicate that we could get something?
Well, you see, the challenge is that we're trying to do structural reforms. We've had many shapes of this one, from ASGISA and all of those other plans that we had for the economic growth. And we're sitting with plans that we're actually deviating from quite consistently, like the part, you know, we can't actually drive the growth that we need. And I think, like I say, the government is trapped. If you do a proper restructure of the economy, you're touching the nerves of many people. But unfortunately for us, every 2 years is electioneering. Yeah. We've got the municipal elections 2 years after the government elections, and then the cycle continues. So you are unable to actually implement the very big changes that can move the needle on our economy. The unions and everyone else have got a say, and unfortunately the government hasn't created a beautiful scenario where people can just vote for the people that are in charge without them giving grants away.
The wage bill is one of those, the
Yes.
public service wage is one of those sensitive issues.
Absolutely. And government tried to offer people early retirement packages at 55 without penalization, but not many people took that up, you know, and that would have helped.
And
in
also,
a major
President Matamela Ramaphosa, was it 2018, Annabel and Zwelakhe and Owen, he promised the country a streamlined government. With less ministries or something like that. But nothing much has really happened. So, sorry, Annabel?
Sorry, I don't know if I'm interrupting.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I was going to say, didn't we hear a few weeks ago that from the president and from some of the ministries that they're looking to amalgamate them and to actually take some of the departments even into the presidential administrative area? So I think we saw that some of the sports ministries, cultural, other ones were going to be reduced and put together so that we would obviously have a smaller civil service.
But Annabel, this is like nearly 5 years. Sorry, it's like 5 years after he became president when he stepped in. It's one of the things that he promised. Yeah. So in an election year, it's a difficult one. I mean, I think Owen is making the point.
That's
Annabel,
it.
That it's a sensitive one. The other sensitive one
is a risky one.
It's a social grants. I mean, you can't touch that.
Yeah, we are stuck, really, definitely. Like I said, the government, the minister, and all the other ministers, it doesn't matter how clever they get. The proposals they put on the table are all dependent on how these are going to be received by the citizens, by government employees, by the unions. So I think that I would love to see Minister Godongwana's own utopian budget. In February, if he could have a budget that is not influenced by all these other parties, I think it will look totally different.
Would you be looking for an indication tomorrow if he's going to do that in February?
Look, like I said, I don't think they can do it. They are stuck. They're stuck in a perennial place where they cannot make the decisions that will make a difference to the economy. Yeah. The rate at which we're growing is always going to be dependent on external factors.
Yeah, I mean, we're about to end shortly, but I just want to give you less than a minute each, just to wrap up. In the media, we like some headlines that look very, easy to grab. You mentioned tough balancing act earlier. I mean, it cannot be a rosy outlook coming out of the medium-term budget tomorrow. Annabel?
No, I don't think so. In February we said a better than expected budget. I'm hoping for that again, but I think realistically it's going to be a tight balancing act. It's really going to be a budget where there's a lot less to go around, and it seems to be more demands.
Okay, Zwelakhe?
I would call it a muddle-through budget. So they're just going to try and balance things as they go. But I don't think we're going to get anywhere. I personally believe that the commitments that have been made by the president in terms of reforms haven't been fulfilled, and I cannot see him fulfilling anything. It's more about being re-elected now.
It's going to be an interesting time tomorrow. Owen, you've sort of indicated what you think, but how do you sum it all up?
No, look, yeah, it's going to be very difficult. But for me, I would like for Transnet to get a relatively decent allocation in order for them to start opening up all those channels that have been closed by the destruction of infrastructure, because there's a lot of stuff we could have exported outside the country to bring back hard currencies. But if Transnet doesn't get that allocation, the scenario will remain the same. We have got a GDP contributor that is locked away because of infrastructure problems.
Yeah, so we're going to have to wait and see what happens tomorrow. Thank you very much, Owen Nkomo, CEO of Inkunzi Wealth Group, Investec's chief economist, Annabel Bishop, and market analyst from the Benguela Global Fund Managers, Zwelakhe Mnguni. Thanks for your time here, helping us just to understand a little bit about what's coming up, what can we expect. And that will be the medium-term budget policy statement, which will be delivered tomorrow afternoon from 2 o'clock. We'll be live in Parliament for you here on eNCA, DSTV Channel 403. And, of course, there'll be some build-up with Masigo Rahlaga during all angles ahead of that 2 o'clock. We'll all be waiting to see. It's going to be really a tough one. More